So this is a new camera that QHY sent me called the Minicam 8 Mono. And this is actually an all-in-one mono package. It's a cooled mono camera, a filter wheel, and 8 custom filters. And to fit that much tech into a package this small is really something unique on the market. And it got me thinking about an astrophotography kit where every piece in the kit is the most mini version in that category. So the Skywatcher Star Adventure GTI is the most mini go-to equatorial mount. The Askar FMA 180 Pro is the most mini apochromatic refractor. And for the guide scope, you could go with any brand's mini guide scope, but I have the ZWOs here. And then in the guide scope, I have a little eyepiece style QHY guide cam, the old reliable 5L2 mono. And then to top it all off, this is a Intel compute stick. I think it's the smallest computer I own and one of the smallest Windows PCs ever made. I use this to control the whole rig. So total cost for the whole rig is a bit over 2,000 bucks US, and that's before other upgrades you'd likely want, like an autofocuser and power management and so forth, that could easily bump it up to 2,500 or 3,000 US. So not the cheapest total if you're just getting into astrophotography. But this isn't a kit I'd actually recommend for someone just getting into astro. For most people, I'd suggest starting into the hobby with gear you already know and use. And if you're not a photographer, then I would just buy a used DSLR to start. I think this kit is a little too complex for someone just jumping in to the hobby today, unless you're really techie. So why did I put this together? Well, partly just for fun, and I'll probably say this a number of times in this video, but I had a blast using this kit. It was super fun to use. Another reason though, I'm thinking this would be good to test is for people upgrading. Let's say you're someone who has a kit like this one. You have the GTI, you have the small telescope, and you've been using a DSLR or a one-shot color astronomy camera, and you've been curious about mono. And you've maybe been on the fence about it because of the cost. You know, it can be around $1,500 to $2,000 just for the camera, the filter wheel, and the filters just to get into it. Well, this new QHY Minicam 8 is everything that you need for mono for $880. And that is actually an outstanding value. It may be one of the best values on the market today in astro gear. Because normally by the time you buy the mono camera, the filter wheel, and the 7 filters, LRGB, SHO, you're probably gonna want all of those eventually, you're looking at around double that, around $1,500 to $2,000 at a minimum, even with a small sensor mono camera. So the value is definitely there with the QHY Minicam 8, but why move from color imaging to mono imaging at all? Well, I've covered this in another video, but I think I'll just summarize my thoughts here. I think the biggest reason is light pollution and narrowband imaging. If you really want to get the most out of narrowband imaging, mono is the way to go. You'll find that the data is cleaner, it's easier to work with, especially if you have a lot of light pollution to contend with. I think the other reason is if you're interested in going after some of the dimmer objects out there, especially the dimmer O3 objects, but also maybe dust regions where having that luminance filter and using LRGB imaging will help. Then I think you'll find mono really works a lot better than color for those more difficult objects. But of course, what I'm talking about is if you're already somewhat experienced in astrophotography, because I don't suggest in your first, couple months where you're just learning focusing and all of that, going out and going after the most difficult objects. But once you have a bit of experience, then I think making the jump to mono imaging makes sense for a lot of people. It made sense for me after just about a year doing deep sky imaging. So I'd say my experiment with everything being mini was mostly a success. The one component that I still won't use outside of this experiment is this. This is that Intel compute stick. When you use a mini PC on a rig, you create a hotspot over Wi-Fi and then you connect to it with like remote desktop software. And I've always run into issues with this one's Wi-Fi dropping out and just being sort of flaky in general. And to be fair, I got this model about 10 years ago, so I'm sure they've probably improved it in the meantime. But I think a fundamental issue with a device this small is the Wi-Fi antenna has to be inside here. So it has to be a tiny little Wi-Fi antenna. So I know that this is a much bigger computer, but if you look at the Wi-Fi antenna on this one, just the antenna is much bigger than the whole computer here. So I like the idea of a PC this small, but I think in the future, I'm just gonna stick to a slightly larger mini PC, not the stick PC design. But I will say I'm not a computer hardware expert by any means, so let me know in the comments what mini PCs and stick PCs you found have worked well for astrophotography, or maybe there's some way to modify this to make it work well. I think at one point I did have it connected to a nano travel router somehow, but it still was like a little too complex for me. And I should say, I know that many people use another popular tiny computer, the Raspberry Pi, and that is on my list to make a video about at some point. There's just a lot to learn there since the whole software stack and drivers on Linux are different than Windows. So it's gonna take me a while to finish that video. All right, other components of this kit to review a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time at all talking about the GTI, since I just made a huge video, a big review video, where I went into a bunch of different telescopes on this mount, and the conclusion, to spoil it, if you haven't watched it yet, is that I thought the best combination with this mount was this telescope, the Askar FMA 180 Pro. It just works the best. It's going to give you just the easiest, most solid results. And this is a telescope that it's only $400, but it really punches above its weight. So in that video though, I was using an APS-C sized sensor on this telescope. And so the Minicam 8 sensor is much smaller than that. So here's the specs on this combo, the Askar FMA 180 with the Minicam 8. And I really like these specs a lot. At around 3 arcseconds per pixel, you're right at the DAW's limit for the FMA 180. So you're sampling at around the theoretical limit of resolution for this aperture. And at this low focal length, you're getting very generous field of view still. So you can still capture the big emission nebulae and the big emission nebulae pairings without mosaicing. Just to show you a few examples of what I mean, here's how this would look with the Horsehead and Flame. Here's Orion and Running Man. Here's North America and the Pelican. And here's the Cygnus Loop. So for me, this field of view is pretty ideal for what I like to capture, these big nebulae scenes. So now let's look a little closer at the Minicam 8 itself. And as I said at the top of this video, QHY sent me this. It's a review unit, but I believe it is a production model, not a pre-release version. The filters are unmounted and rectangular, and they come in a little plastic blister pack, so a little difficult to install if you're clumsy, but the instructions were well done on the QHY website, and QHY supplies these plastic tweezers and everything else that you need for installation of the filters. It also comes with the right adapter stack, this right here, so that you can go from the threads on the filter wheel here, which are pretty small, to 48mm threads, and be right at the 55mm backspacing that's common on a lot of telescopes. So getting going with the Minicam 8 was definitely easy. On the back of the camera, we have the locking 12-volt power port that's common with QHY cameras. You don't have to use the locking threads, but QHY supplies a nice cable to do so. And then you have the USB 3 port. You do need to connect both the USB and the power for the camera to show up on your computer. ASCOM driver installation was easy. It's already part of QHY's beta all-in-one download. And I've had no driver issues at all, either with the camera or the filter wheel. One thing I found really fun about this camera is because the sensor is so small, I could cool it down to -50°C without the cooler even breaking a sweat. With most cooled cameras I've used, even on the coldest nights, I'm only going down to like -30°C. So -50 was fun for me as a new record for deep cooling the sensor. Of course, it will depend on your ambient temperature. While the snow just melted here in New Hampshire this week, I'm still getting slightly below freezing at night. But I will say, based on the cooler only running at around 30% to maybe 40% power to get to -50°C now, I wouldn't be surprised if I may be able to still hit -50 in the summer. But that's speculation. So to wrap up this video, let's look at my test images from this kit. I don't have deep integrations here because it is spring in New Hampshire, so I'm getting what I can get between the short breaks in the clouds. Okay, here are the tech specs. I won't read all of these, but just to sum up how much data I actually got, I got about 30 minutes of RGB and a little over an hour of S2, a little over an hour of O3, and about 90 minutes of HA. And I don't think I mentioned this previously in this review, so I'll just mention it here. The SHO filters with the Minicam 8, if you buy it with the filters, are 7 nanometer filters. And how did I pick these exposure times? Well, I just put it on the preset for Deep Sky, which put it at gain 69, and then just tried a few things and found that 30 seconds with red, green, blue, and 3 minutes with SHO seemed about right. Okay, so first let's just look at what came out just from calibrating, registering, and stacking. So this is about 90 minutes of HA. You can see we're getting plenty of signal there. Here's 72 minutes of O3. You can see mostly pick up O3 signal in the tadpoles region. Here's 72 minutes of S2, which seems to sort of mostly mimic the HA, but just picks up the brighter parts. This is actually fairly good S2 signal for any part of the sky. I'd say that the Riga region here that we're looking at is a nice candidate for picking up sulfur. And then here's 30 minutes of RGB. And I just wanted to show, if people were interested, here's a aberration inspector on that. And as you'd expect from a fairly small sensor, not really seeing any elongation or particular issues in the corners. Everything looks pretty equalized in terms of the center and the corners. Okay, and then I just ran a blur exterminator and star exterminator on each of these just to show you what they look like in starless with a little bit of deconvolution as well. And I think the HA looks really nice. I'm seeing some, nice 3D pop here. The O3 is still a bit noisy with only 72 minutes. And then we're also seeing some residual halos on the bright stars. That's very common with O3 filters. The only ones I think that are really halo free today are probably the chromas. So I expected that, of course. With almost any O3 filter, you're going to get some halos on bright stars. Not really seeing much haloing, maybe just a tiny bit with the S2 filter, but this looks pretty good. And then just to complete it out, here's the RGB starless. And you can see there's some residual halo stuff on the bright blue stars with RGB. That's also common when you remove stars from red, green, blue. Okay, and then here's my attempt to process just as an HA RGB image. Just so this is fairly sort of a naturalistic representation of the area, just enhanced by the HA signal. And I'll zoom in here just a little bit just to show you some of my favorite parts. So this is definitely my favorite thing in HA RGB. I love how that blue reflection nebula, the flaming star, looks against the red hydrogen. That's just a really nice contrast there in natural color. There's the tadpoles, which looks good too. And there's the spider. I think the spider would need a little bit more to sort of bring out some of the interesting stuff, but you're starting to see some promise there. Okay, and then here's my attempt to take that HA RGB representation and incorporate the S2 and the O3. And if we just look at this one compared to this one, it definitely brings a lot of dynamism to the tadpoles area, the O3 does. I'll zoom in on that a little bit. You can see there's a lot of interesting contrast there. Overall, for, you know, a couple hours, I think this looks great and shows a lot of promise. I think that in terms of just sort of what to expect if you really give this camera enough time to work is something like this. So this HA starless representation, 90 minutes on a Riga, it's looking already pretty clean with and this is no noise reduction, just blur exterminator and star exterminator. On these final representations, I did do a little bit of noise reduction. Well, I'll just make these final representations full screen here for a few seconds each and say goodbye on this one. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions about the QHY Minicam 8, drop them in the comments, and clear skies.